Yes. The Roman emperors had granted barbarian mercenaries, foreign fighters, land, right? And it will be these barbarians who eventually come as new rulers. So let me just copy and paste this here. What is the Dark Ages? The forces of darkness overwhelmed the forces of light, the Romans. What are we looking at here, David? Yeah, good. Good. So you can see here's the Byzantine Empire here, the East Roman Empire, who they were able to bribe the Huns, gave them gold and other and other influences to kind of encourage them to attack the West. Okay, so they bribed them into attacking the West, who was much weaker at this time than the East. Go ahead. So Byzantine gold coin, right? Where the term comes. So ruled similar to that of Rome, right? With governors, bureaucracy, and the imperial army. Here's the Byzantine Empire, 814. By 814. David? Roman. Yes. Good. So the influence of the church starts to increase as they gain more, as the Catholic Church has much more power. Pope and the Patriarch. The Pope in the west, Patriarch in the east. The church, David. So the church and state were linked together during this period. Okay? Church and the king. One more, David. Good. St. Augustine, good. Very important. Okay, and next we're going to learn about Justinian the Great. Okay, before we do that, I have just a video here to go through. Justinian and the Byzantine Empire. Okay, so let's watch this. Really good.
In previous videos, we talk about how, as we exit the 4th century in the 390s, the Emperor Theodosius, he actually splits the Roman Empire. We already had the city of Constantinople being established as a capital of the empire. That was done by Constantine in 324, the city previously known as Byzantium. But as we enter into the 5th century, there was an official split between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. They were actually governed separately. Now, also in other videos, we talk about the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, one thing to keep in mind, sometimes when we talk about the fall of the West, it somehow implies that there's no governance left or there's no kingdoms left, and nothing could be further from the truth. One of the reasons why the Western Roman Empire fell is repeated attacks by Germanic tribes. And after the Western Roman Empire was gone, the Germanic tribes, for the most part, took over. On the Italian peninsula, you at first have the kingdom of Odoacer, but eventually you have rule, especially as we get into the late 5th century, you have the Ostrogothic kingdom, Ostrogoths, the Eastern Goths, the Eastern Germanic tribes. Here in North Africa, you have the Vandals, another Germanic tribe. Here in the Iberian Peninsula, you have the Visigoths, the Western Goths, yet another Germanic tribe. Here you have the Burgundians, you have the Franks. The word France comes from the notion of land of the Franks. Once again, all of these are Germanic kingdoms that took over where before you had the Western Roman Empire. Now, as you can see from this map, and we've talked about it in previous videos, it was only the Western Roman Empire that fell and fragmented and for the most part came into the hands of these Germanic tribes. The Eastern Empire continues on, and it's often known as the Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople. Now, what we'll see is that the Byzantine Empire lasts for almost another 1,000 years, but its importance in the region diminishes for most of that period. It does have one last hurrah, so to speak, with the reign of Emperor Justinian. Justinian is able to come to power in 527. He comes into power with the help of his uncle, who's the previous emperor, Justin. And Justinian is able to regain much of the land that was lost to the Germanic tribes. Over the course of Justinian's reign, as you can see, they're able to retake the Italian peninsula and much of North Africa. Now, things weren't always easy for Justinian, and they're very difficult at the beginning of his rule, and they get hard near the end of his rule as well. In 532, there's significant rioting in Constantinople, which is his capital. It all starts around chariot racing and the different groups or gangs that support the different chariot racing teams, but it eventually becomes an all-out revolt against Justinian. And many of Justinian's advisors, and including Justinian himself, they're afraid that they're going to be overthrown and killed, and they think about fleeing Constantinople. And this is only 5 years into his reign. This is in 532. And at that point, his wife, Empress Theodora, stands up and becomes a very important actor in history. She has her famous speech at the point in time when Justinian and his advisors were thinking about fleeing, fear of death. They thought they were going to be overthrown. And here's that famous quote from Empress Theodora. "The present occasion is too serious to allow me to follow the convention that a woman should not speak in a man's council. Those whose interests are threatened by extreme danger should think only of the wisest course of action, not of conventions. In my opinion, flight is not the right course, even if it should bring us to safety. It is impossible for a person, having been born into this world, not to die. But for one who has reigned, it is intolerable to be a fugitive. May I never be deprived of this purple robe," the purple robe signifying royalty, being an empress. "And may I never see the day when those who meet me do not call me empress. If you wish to save yourself," so she's talking to Justinian and Justinian's advisors, "if you wish to save yourself, my lord, there is no difficulty. We are rich. Over there is the sea, and there are the ships. Yet reflect for a moment whether, when you have once escaped to a place of security, you would not gladly exchange such safety for death. As for me, I agree with the adage that the royal purple is the noblest shroud." So she's saying, I would rather die as an empress than try to be a fugitive and just try to live my life, the rest of my life, somehow comfortably. And she's able to convince Justinian, and they're able to put down the uprising quite brutally, killing 30,000 of the people who are rising up against them. Now, during that uprising, much of Constantinople is burned, including the main church, the Hagia Sophia. And it was under Justinian's rule that the Hagia Sophia gets rebuilt. And it still exists in what is now Istanbul today. Constantinople eventually gets renamed Istanbul once it's conquered by the Turks. And it eventually gets turned into a mosque, and today it is a museum. The Hagia Sophia literally means holy wisdom. You might recognize the word Sophia from philosophy, which literally means friend of wisdom, philosophia. Now, perhaps what Justinian is most famous for is his attempt to better codify a set of laws. The Roman Empire, of course, always had laws, but Justinian got legal experts to go and collect the laws of the land, to make them consistent, to throw out the laws that are inconsistent, to add new laws as necessary. And he did this over his entire reign, and he spread them. And they are often referred to as the Code of Justinian. And they would have an influence on the Byzantine Empire for the next 900 years, and even some influence on some relatively modern schools of law. Now, as I've mentioned before, The reign of Justinian is considered really the high point of the Byzantine Empire. And even as we get into roughly the second half of his reign, things start to slide downward, and over the next 900 years are just in a state of decline. Starting in the 540s, there's a significant plague in the Byzantine Empire. Some accounts I've seen show that roughly 40% of Constantinople dies. Significant chunk of the population of the Byzantine Empire dies. And that makes it more susceptible to attack from the various Germanic tribes. Throughout Justinian's reign and well after Justinian's reign, there's constant tension and often conflict between the Sassanid Persians in the east. And then as we go further on, especially as we get into the 7th and 8th century, you have the rise of Islam. Early Islamic empires are able to take over the Sassanids and significantly eat into the Byzantine Empire, and then even some of the Germanic kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. And so this is taking us now, we're in the middle of the 8th century. And if we go further on, we see this, once again, gradual decline continue on, where you have further invasions into the Byzantine Empire from Turkish Muslim kingdoms or Turkish Muslim conquerors, all the way until we get to 1453, when Constantinople itself falls to the Turks and eventually gets renamed Istanbul.
Okay, so that's a really good overview there of the Byzantine Empire and Justinian. Okay, I just have one more short. It's a biography. It's 1 minute long of Justinian. So let's just watch this before we come back to our PowerPoint. Justinian.
Justinian I, or Justinian the Great, was born in Sardinia and was Roman emperor from 527 to 565 AD. Justinian I devoted his reign as Roman emperor to recovering the former greatness of the empire and reconquering lands lost in the western half of the empire. Justinian's generals conquered kingdoms in North Africa and the southern Iberian Peninsula, and restored Italy and Rome to the empire after they had been taken by the Ostrogoth and Byzantine barbarian hordes 50 years previously. He re-established control over the western Mediterranean. Justinian's main legacy was the complete rewriting of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which remains to this day the basis of law for many countries and states. He also implemented new laws to protect women from prostitution and brutality. Justinian surrounded himself with advisors and generals, and the appointment of his staff was based on merit rather than nobility, and under his leadership the empire streamlined tax collection, which enabled the re-expansion of the empire. Despite being struck down with bubonic plague in the early 540s and losing his wife in 548, Justinian survived another 20 years and died in Constantinople. He was succeeded by Justin II, his nephew from his sister Vigilantia, as he had no children to inherit his title.
All right. Let's go back to our PowerPoint here, and our next slide is on Justinian. So just an overview of what we've already watched. Sabrina, can you read for me, please?
Sure. Justinian the Great ruled 527 to 565 CE. Byzantine emperor, goal to reunite the Roman world as a Christian empire and suppressed all paganism. Ordered the codification of Roman laws in the Justinian Code, or body of civil law that defined civil law in the Middle Ages and in the modern world. During his reign, Latin was the official language of the Byzantine Empire, but was later changed to Greek.
So he's going to be certainly our main focus today is on Justinian. So these are the notes that you're certainly going to need to know. All right. And here's the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, so 500s. Once again, uniting Italy under the empire. Let's read a little bit more, okay? Just a little bit more. Sabrina, please.
Moro, how do you say that?
Merovingians.
Merovingians. Merovingian is derived from the leader of the Franks, first dynasty after the Romans, and ruled for 300 years. 481 CE. Leader Clovis I. United Frankish tribes and expanded territory. His conversion to Christianity won him support from the church. Clovis I wrote Salic law, assigned a specific financial value to everyone and everything. Merovingians founded and built many monasteries, churches, and palaces, and spread Christianity throughout Western Europe.
Here's the Frankish kingdom of 700s. Land of the Franks, right? France. And the Carolingians, Sabrina.
Carolingians, rise of aristocratic Charles Martel, who dominated Frankish kingdom in the 8th century. He confiscated land given to the church and began church reforms. His son Pepin the Short continued church reforms and eventually removed the last Merovingian king from the throne. Established the Carolingian dynasty, named to protect the papacy and to establish the pope and bishops are makers of kings. Greatest legacy was Charles the Great or Charlemagne.
Okay, so this will be the last slide for today, the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne. Go ahead.
Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who was a military general and restored Pope Leo III, who had been exiled. In return, Leo placed a crown on Charlemagne and named him Emperor of the Romans, secured the relationship between Frankish kings and the papacy. Charlemagne became the first ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, dynasty that would last for more than 700 years. Charlemagne imposed order on the empire through the church and state. He ordered the standardization of Latin and promoted education and produced a precise written language, Latin.
Okay. I'm going to stop there for my PowerPoint for early Middle Ages. Okay. And what I would like you to do now is I'm going to have you work on just this is in-class work. Okay. So again, today's main focus is the Byzantine Empire. So I've attached here the Byzantine Empire. It's a very short read. It's, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 to 5 pages. Pretty short read here. Okay, you're going to read this. If you want to take notes, just copy down the important points, which are in bold. Okay, and then based on this short reading, it's very short, you have just a few questions. You can even answer 1 to 5. 1 is just definitions, and then some pretty easy questions. So just answer questions 1 to 5. This is just in-class work, so I'm not going to create a Dropbox today. I will at some point, but right now I just want this to be in-class work. Okay. So yeah, so just questions 1 to 5, pretty straightforward, and it's all based on this read. Okay, on the Byzantine Empire, a new Rome in a new setting. Okay, so everything is in this package right here. Okay, so I'd like everybody to read, take some notes on maybe some new terms that you learned, and then answer questions 1, which is definitions, and then 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, you don't have to answer 6 to 9, just 1 to 5, and it's all based on this reading. Okay, so it's on the Byzantine Empire, Justinian, and the split of the church. Okay, so I'd like everybody to do that for me now, please. Independent reading. Okay, I will write the homework in the chat. Okay, so get started now, please.